An old trapper watched from the ridge and would not forget. A Lakota chief rode to where he pointed. The rifle had been in my hands so long it didn't feel like an object anymore, more like a limb that happened to be made of iron and walnut. I'd carried that Hawkins since before the war, the first war, the one they don't name after a president, and I knew its weight the way I knew the weight of a bad winter coming in off the Laramie Range. Bone deep. Certain. I was up on the East Ridge, the one the Arapaho used to call the shoulder, when I saw the column of riders moving through the valley below. 12, 14 men. Kansas men, by the cut of their saddles and the way they sat, upright and certain of themselves, in the way men get when they've been telling other men what to do for long enough that they start believing the land owes them the same deference. I watched them for a long time. That's the thing about getting old in a country that doesn't want you anymore. You learn to watch. Back when I was running beaver in the high country, we didn't move through territory without reading it first. A full morning sometimes, sitting with it, letting the country speak before you answered it. The animals knew this. Every horse, every mule, every predator out here worked the same way. It was the men who came late who didn't know how. The young men who came out after the war moved like they were trying to be somewhere else before they'd finished being where they were. These Kansas men were the same. They rode like they were already done with the valley, already past it in their heads, already at the thing they intended to take. What they intended to take was the herd. I knew whose herd it was, had known for 3 years. 160 horses, wintered on the flat ground at the bend of the Powder, watched over by a small Lakota band under a chief named Chayton, which means, near as I ever figured it, something like falcon, something like the thing that sees from high up and drops when it's time. I'd traded with Chayton twice. First time I gave her 3 steel traps and a good skinning knife for a winter's worth of lodging and 2 horses. Second time, there was nothing to trade. She'd found me face down in the mud of a creek bed in late November, more dead than not, and brought me into camp, and they worked on me for 11 days before I came back to something you could call living. I never properly paid that debt. A man doesn't, not always. Some things you just carry. I watched the Kansas men ride. The valley had 3 ways into it and 2 ways out. That's one of the first things I'd learned, years ago, going through it with a Crow guide named Stans Farr, who'd since died of a chest sickness, and whose name I still said under my breath sometimes when I was alone, which was often. The Kansas men were taking the north entry, which meant they'd cross the open flat before they hit the herd's winter range. It also meant they'd be riding into the sun if they came back out the same way, which told me they hadn't scouted it properly. Men who have scouted a valley know which direction puts the sun in your eyes on the return. These men had not scouted. They were going in blind on other people's horses, in other people's territory, with that particular confidence that comes not from knowledge, but from numbers and firearms, and the belief, the deep, worked-into-the-bone belief, that certain kinds of men don't have to know a country because the country will simply yield. It had yielded often enough that the belief felt like a law of nature to them. I had watched that belief operate for years. I had watched it take things it had no right to. I had watched it operate on people who deserved better, and I had not always done anything about it, which was a thing I lived with in the way you live with scars, not with pleasure but with the full knowledge that they are part of the map of you now. I made a decision. It wasn't a complicated one. I didn't argue with myself about it or play out consequences in the careful way a younger man might have. I just climbed down off the shoulder the back way, into the draw that ran west, and I rode for the Lakota winter camp. My horse, a Grulla mare I'd taken in trade from a Mexican freighter the previous spring, was the color of smoke and moved quiet over rock. I pushed her harder than I liked. She didn't complain. She had that quality in her: when you asked, she gave, and she didn't need you to explain why. I thought riding about whether I was doing the right thing, not in any hand-wringing way, just the way a man sometimes turns a decision over to make sure it holds its shape from all sides. What I was about to do was warn a Lakota chief about armed men coming for her horses. The men from back east who wrote the papers and drew the lines would probably have had something to say about that, about whose side I was on. But I'd been out in this country for 40-some years, and what I'd learned, the thing that had cost me the most and held the longest, was that there aren't sides. There's only what's right and what's not, and the question you have to answer every time, alone in your own chest, is which one you're standing with. I was standing with the horses and the people they belonged to. I rode. The camp was 3 miles west and tucked into a stand of bare cottonwood along the creek. There were maybe 40 people, the fires low because they'd learned not to throw light in winter. I came in from the north approach, which was the one they expected visitors to use if visitors were coming honest, and a young man with a Spencer rifle stepped out in front of me before I'd cleared the trees. I said Chayton's name, said it once, said it like I had business saying it, which I did. The young man looked at me for a long moment. He would have been maybe 19. There was a set to his face that I recognized, not unfriendly, but the particular carefulness of a person who has learned that strangers arrive in 3 kinds: those who mean nothing, those who mean well, and those who mean harm. He was trying to sort me. I let him sort me. I sat on the grulla and didn't reach for anything and let him look. The mare stood steady. She had better manners than most people I'd known. He brought me to Chayton. Chayton was a tall woman. That's the first thing people said, the ones who'd met her. Tall, and the way she moved in a space made the space seem like it had been arranged for her specifically. She was in her middle 30s. I never asked. She never said, and she'd been chief of this band for 4 years, since her father died of a broken leg that went bad in the cold. The men in her band didn't say much about this fact. It was just the fact. She had earned what she'd earned in ways I didn't know all of and didn't need to know all of. A man doesn't need to know all the chapters to know what book he's reading. What I knew was that she was smart and she was straight. When she said a thing, she meant it. When she gave her word, she kept it. In my experience, that combination is rarer than any other resource the country has to offer and is worth more than all of them put together. She was sitting near the center fire when the young man brought me in, and she looked at me the way she always looked at me, like she was reading the back of the page through the front, just taking it in, not unfriendly, not warm yet either, waiting on what I'd say, giving me the space to say it, neither hurrying me nor making me feel slow. I said, "There are 14 armed men coming through the north entry of the valley, and they are not coming to trade." She didn't ask how I knew. She'd learned in our 3 years of acquaintance that I did not report what I had not seen. This was the currency between us, the economy of it. I said things I'd witnessed. She listened the way you listen to things worth listening to. She said in English, "How long?" I said 2 hours, maybe less. The light was going. She looked at the fire for a moment. Not a long moment. A working moment, the kind where a mind is moving fast underneath a still face. Then she said something in Lakota to a man across the fire, older man, braided hair going silver, a face that had survived a great many decisions, and he got up without a word and went out. She looked at me again. She said, "You rode from the shoulder." I said yes. She said fast. I said the mare runs good. She said sit down. I sat. We waited in that camp for an hour and a half, while outside I could hear the movements that a camp makes when it is quietly reorganizing itself around a danger. No shouting, no drama. Just the purposeful sounds of people who have done this before, who know where each thing needs to go and how long it takes to get there, who have practiced this particular rearrangement of themselves so many times that it has become a kind of muscle memory. I sat near Chayton's fire and I drank the tea she poured me, which was made from something I'd never been able to identify in 15 years of living in this country, and tasted like a pine forest and cold water and something bitter underneath that wasn't unpleasant. I'd asked her once what it was made of, and she'd said medicine and left it there. She didn't speak much during that hour. I didn't either. There wasn't much to say that couldn't wait, and both of us had been in enough tight situations to know that talking to fill silence is what nervous people do, and that nervous people tend to make things worse. What I thought about sitting there was the 14 men and what they'd find when they got through the north entry. What they were planning was simple enough. Take the horses, run them east before anyone could organize a response, sell them in Kansas or beyond. It was an old plan. Men had been running that plan on this country since before I was born. The plan relied on speed and on the general assumption that the people you were stealing from would be surprised. They would not be surprised. And that, I thought, was because of what I'd done. Was because of the 3 miles I'd ridden on a smoke-colored mare in the cold. Was because I'd learned long ago that watching isn't enough, that a man who sees a thing and does nothing with the seeing is just a spectator, and being a spectator in a country this hard is a kind of cowardice dressed up as patience. I'd been a spectator before. I am not proud of the times I was. There were 2 occasions in particular, one on the Republican River in the summer of '58, one near a trading post outside of Bent's Fort a few years before that, when I'd seen things happen that I could have interrupted and did not. I carried those. A man carries the things he didn't do as well as the things he did, and the ones he didn't do are heavier, generally, because they don't have any satisfaction attached to them. Tonight there would be no not doing. Chayton refilled my tea without being asked. I looked at her across the fire and she looked at me, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was its neighbor, a recognition, a kind of settled regard. Like I had been a question that she'd been carrying for a while and was now closer to being answered. She said, "You came a long way to warn us." I said 3 miles. She said, "I don't mean tonight." I didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the thing she'd said. So I just looked at the fire and let it stand there between us, solid and warm. What happened in the valley that night, I only saw part of. Chayton's people were already positioned at the 2 western exits and along the low ridge that ran south of the herd's winter range. The 14 men rode in exactly as I'd read them. They found the horses. They began to move them. They did not get far. I didn't see the specifics. I'd been asked quietly by the silver-haired man whose name I learned that night was Soaring Elk, to stay back at a particular point along the south ridge, and to fire my rifle once if any of the 14 broke past and headed east. It was a sensible request. I was old and cold and not a fighting man anymore in the way I once had been, but I still had eyes and I still had the hawkin, and I still knew how to sit still on a ridge in the dark and wait without moving and without making noise, which is the most important skill in this country, and the one that takes the longest to learn, and the one that nobody teaches you straight. You learn it from having failed it, from the animals that ran because you shifted wrong, from the men who never came back because they didn't know how to hold still. None of the 14 broke east. I heard it end before I saw anything. The sounds of horses and men, and something that was not quite fighting and not quite surrender but somewhere in between, the particular set of noises that occurs when men realize, all at once, that what they thought was going to happen is not going to happen, and that where they thought they were standing is not where they actually are. There's a specific quality to that realization when it happens fast, in the dark, when men had been certain, and then become uncertain in the span of about 30 seconds. I'd heard it before. It sounds like confusion first, and then it sounds like nothing, and the nothing is its own kind of loud. Then it was quiet. I waited on the ridge for another hour. The cold came down hard, the way it does after midnight in late winter, dropping fast and mean. I had my coat and the mare was still, breathing slow white puffs into the dark. Eventually, Soaring Elk came back and found me and said something in Lakota and pointed back toward the camp. I'd learned enough of the language over the years to understand that he was saying it was done, and I could come. I came. The 14 men had been collected and their guns had been taken. They were sitting together at the north end of the valley under the attention of 4 young men with rifles, looking cold and thoroughly reduced. I recognized 2 of them. One was a man I'd seen in Cheyenne Town twice, a broad-shouldered man who moved like he was used to being the biggest thing in the room. He wasn't the biggest thing in this valley. Not tonight. Chayton stood in the open ground between the collected men and the main body of her people. She was wearing a heavy blanket over her coat, and she had a rifle across her forearms, not raised, just present. In the moonlight she looked like something that had grown up out of the ground, like the valley had made her, and put her there specifically to stand in that spot. She spoke to the 14 men, in English carefully and not loudly, which was somehow more frightening than if she'd shouted. She said, "You came for what belongs to us. You found us waiting. You can leave here or you can stay here, but if you stay here without our permission, you stay here permanently." She said, "Your horses are at the east exit. Ride them east and keep riding and don't come back to this valley." The broad-shouldered man looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man revising a great deal of his prior thinking very quickly. The kind of revising that happens when the world turns out to be organized differently than you built your confidence around. It's not a comfortable thing to watch happen to a person. It is true, though. Something true comes into a man's face when the assumptions he's been operating on fall away all at once. Whatever comes after that is more honest than what came before. He nodded just once. They left. It was later the fires rebuilt. The horses settled back into the flat, the night quieting down, that Chayton came and sat beside me. I was at the edge of the camp, drinking what I thought was more of her pine bitter tea but turned out to be something else, something that tasted like a good decision made at the right time. The cold had broken slightly, or I'd stopped noticing it. Both things happen and it's hard to tell them apart at that hour. She sat close. Not touching, but close, the kind of proximity that in this country at this hour says more than most sentences. She said, "How did you know what they were doing?" I said, "Seen it before. The way they sat their horses, the direction they came. Men who have got permission to be in a valley don't ride like that." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You've been watching this valley a long time." I said, "I've been watching most of this country a long time." She said, "Why?" I thought about that. It was a good question. Simple on the outside but with weight underneath it. The kind of question that seems like it's asking about habit but is actually asking about character. I said, "Because somebody should." She said, "There are things I don't know about you." I said, "Same." She said, "I know that you are a man who came and told us when you didn't have to, who didn't wait to see which way it would go, who rode for us in the cold and sat on a ridge in the dark and didn't move." I said, "That's not much." She said, "It's more than most." There was a silence. The good kind, the kind that isn't empty but filled up with the weight of what's already been said, and what doesn't need to be said, and the cold air, and the firelight, and the horses blowing somewhere off in the dark. She reached over then and put her hand on my forearm, just her hand on my arm through the coat. Not a gesture of romance exactly, not a gesture of gratitude either, something older than both of those things, something that has to do with recognition. With one person looking at another person and saying in the oldest language there is, "I see you. You are real. What you did was real. What you have been out here all these years is real, and I am not looking past it." I looked at her hand, and then I looked at her. She looked back the way she'd looked at me from the beginning, like she was reading the back through the front, like she'd been turning a page, and had now gotten to something she was going to remember. She said, "You have a place here if you want one. The winter is long." I said, "I know how long the winter is." She almost smiled, closer than usual. She said, "Then stay, help us watch." I did not say yes that night, and I did not say no. I rode back to my own camp before first light, a lean camp, just the essentials, on a bench above a small tributary that ran east into the Powder. I had a tent of elk hide that had seen better years, and a fire ring I'd used so many times the stones were black all the way through. I lay down in my blankets and listened to the creek and thought about what she'd said. Help us watch. It sounds like a small thing when you say it plain like that, but in the life I'd been living, the particular shape of solitary that becomes a man's habit when he's been alone long enough, it was not small at all. It was the size of a turning point. It was the size of a question that, once answered, doesn't go back to being a question. I lay there for a long time. The creek talked to itself the way creeks do, and the fire died, and the cold came in harder, and I thought about what my life had been and what it was now, and what it might become if I made a different choice than the ones I'd been making. I had a reputation in this country, among the men who knew me, which was not many, as a man who knew the land and didn't much care for other men's company. This was mostly true and partly wrong. I cared for company the same as anyone. I just had enough bad experience of it that I'd learned to require something from it before I let it in. I required honesty. I required a person to mean what they said. I required that, when they told you something, it would hold up in the light the next morning, and not have changed in the night. Most people failed that requirement. Chayton didn't. 3 years of trading with her, which, in the economy of this country, means 3 years of being the kind of honest that has real stakes, because if you cheat in a trade out here you don't get a second chance, and if you give your word you make sure your word is worth giving, and she had never once failed it. Every deal straight. Every arrangement held to. Everything said plain. I thought about the creek bed where she'd found me. Late November. I'd been crossing back from a long season north of the Powder, and I'd made a mistake. The kind that even experienced men make when they're tired and pushing too hard, and the cold has been at them for long enough that their judgment starts to go around the edges. I'd crossed onto ice that wasn't solid enough, and it went, and I went with it. And what I remembered after that was very cold water and then nothing. And then waking up inside a hide tent with my feet wrapped, and my hands wrapped, and a fire burning, and a woman sitting across from me who I'd traded with twice, looking at me the way you look at something you've pulled out of a river, and aren't yet sure is going to survive. She'd found me in that creek bed, her and 2 of the younger men. They'd pulled me out and got me back to the camp and kept me warm for 11 days. The 11th day, I could sit up without help. The 12th day, I could stand. The 13th day, I could walk to the edge of the camp and back. I tried to give her something for it. I had trade goods, I had tools. She refused everything. She said, "You would have done the same," which was true, I thought, though I wondered if she decided that from evidence or from a kind of generosity that assumed better of people than was always warranted. Later I understood that, with her, it was usually evidence. She watched a person the way I watched a country, patiently, thoroughly, from multiple angles, accumulating information before she committed to an assessment. What she'd said wasn't generosity. It was observation. She'd been watching me since the first trade, years before the creek. She'd drawn her conclusion. I lay in my blankets and looked at the dark and thought about a woman who had watched me for years, and decided I was worth keeping. I got up before dawn and broke camp. I rode to her. The second thing that happened, in that long winter after the 14 men, was a different kind of test, and I want to tell it right because it matters to what came after. In late January, 3 men came into the valley from the south. Not armed men like the 14, these 3 were traders, or said they were, and they had a small wagon and enough goods to be convincing on the surface. I was out checking the southern approach when they came through, and I watched them the way I always watched newcomers, and something in the way they moved the wagon struck me wrong. Too deliberate, too aware of where they were stopping. I rode back to camp and told Chayton. She said, "Describe them." I described them, the way they sat, the goods on the wagon. The particular way the youngest of the 3 kept looking at the horse lines, without appearing to look at them. She was quiet for a moment. She said, how sure are you? I said, not certain, but sure enough. She said, what would you do? I thought about it. I said, talk to them. Not through you, through me. Let them think they're talking to a trapper passing through. Men like that will say things to an old trapper they won't say to a chief. She looked at me for a moment. She said, all right. I rode out and I talked to the three men. I was just an old trapper. I was heading north. I'd stopped because I'd seen their wagon and thought maybe they had tobacco to sell, which I needed. The oldest of them was a careful man who gave away very little. The middle one was a nervous man who gave away too much. The youngest was the one who worried me. He had flat eyes and a very still face, and he kept doing the horse-line math behind those flat eyes while we talked about tobacco and the weather and where the passes were. I bought the tobacco. I rode back. I told Chayton, the youngest one is the problem. He's counting horses and routes. The other two I don't know about, maybe honest, maybe not, but the youngest one is counting horses and routes. She said, how do you know? I said, I've seen that face before. It's a face a man makes when he's memorizing something. She looked at me. She said, what do we do? And that was the moment, the one I keep coming back to when I think about that winter, not the moment she rode where I pointed. Before that, this one, because what she said was, what do we do? Not, what do I do? Not, I'll take it from here. She said we, and she waited for the answer, and she meant it. I said, let them go, but tell Soaring Elk to watch the south approach for the next month. She said, Soaring Elk has been watching the south approach since the 14 men. I said, good. She said, you thought of Soaring Elk. I said, he's who I'd want on the south approach. She nodded, just once, the way she nodded when a thing was right and she'd registered it. The three men left the next morning. Soaring Elk watched the south approach for 6 weeks. The youngest one came back in early March, alone, on a fast horse, and Soaring Elk was where he needed to be, and the youngest man turned around 2 miles from the valley and didn't come back. We never talked much about that. Chayton told me what Soaring Elk had seen, and I told her what I thought it meant, and she agreed, and then we went back to the other work of the day. But something had settled in it, the kind of settling that happens when a thing has been tested and held. I stayed. Not just that winter, though the winter was long and hard, and we lost 3 horses to the cold in February, and Soaring Elk's youngest daughter was sick for 2 weeks in a way that frightened everyone, and then suddenly was not sick anymore, which frightened no one and relieved everyone considerably. I spent most of that time doing useful things with my hands, fixing a broken wheel on a travois, resetting a tent pole, going out twice to bring in game when the stores ran low. The ordinary work of being in a place and being of use to it. There is a different weight to a day when it ends with you having been needed. I told myself for years I was fine alone, fine with just the hawkin and the grulla and the country, and I was fine. Fine is a real thing, not nothing. But there is something past fine that doesn't have a good name and that you only recognize when you've been without it for a long stretch and then have it back. It is the weight of eyes that see you, of knowing that what you know matters to someone, of a place at a fire that is specifically yours, not offered out of courtesy or charity but because you've earned it, because the chair fits you and they know it. Chayton ran her band the way she ran everything, direct, thoughtful, harder than you expected and gentler than you expected in turns, and always with the particular steadiness of a person who has accepted the responsibility she carries and stopped wasting energy resenting it. She was good at the things that matter. She was good at reading a situation without filling it with her own assumptions before she'd had a chance to look at it. She was good at knowing when to move and when to hold still, which is, I have come to believe after more years than I like to count, the whole of leadership, if you distill it far enough. She was also, I came to find, good at listening, not in the way of someone waiting for you to stop talking so they can start again. In the actual way, The way where you feel that the thing you've said has been received, has been registered somewhere, is being turned over and considered with care. Nobody had listened to me in a long time. Men my age, out in this country without connection, generally aren't listened to. We are looked past. We are tolerated. We are occasionally useful and frequently invisible. The young men who come out now don't want to know what the country used to be or how it used to work or what you've seen over 40-some years of crossing and recrossing it. They want to make their own mistakes, which is their right and probably the only way learning works for most people. But it does leave you talking mostly to yourself and to a horse. Chayton listened. She asked about the country, about the passes and the water sources and the places where game held in hard winters, and the ones that looked promising on the surface and were empty underneath. She asked about the men coming from the east, the different kinds of them, the difference between the ones who were land-hungry in the settled homestead sense, and the ones who were just moving through, and the ones like the 14 who had a specific kind of intention and meant to act on it quickly and be gone. She asked what I made of the government talk she'd been hearing, the treaty talk, the paper and signature talk that had a way of meaning something different to the men who wrote the papers than it did to the people who were supposed to live inside what the papers described. I told her what I knew, which was less than I wished and more than most. I had been in this country when the only marks on it were the ones the river made going down to the sea, and I had watched what came after, the marks that men from back east put on it, the lines on paper and the lines of fences and the lines of rail, and I understood that these marks were not going to stop. There was a tide in it. This I told her plain, because she deserved plain, and she was the kind of person who could take plain without it breaking her. She listened, she thought, then she said, "Then we must know what is coming better than those who are bringing it." She looked at me when she said that. She said, "You are good at that." She meant it as a statement of fact, not a compliment, which is how the real compliments work. Not the ones that sound like something you'd put on a sign, but the ones that sound like someone read you accurate and said what they saw. No decoration on it. Just the fact of it, offered the way you offer a good tool, because it's right for the job and you know it and you're not going to pretend otherwise. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "I will tell you something. When soaring elk brought you to my fire that first winter, the winter we found you in the creek bed, some of the men in this band did not want to keep you. An old trapper alone in the cold. What use?" I said, "I wondered about that." She said, "I told them that a man who has crossed this country as many times as you have carries maps in him that have not been drawn yet, that his eyes are worth keeping." I thought about that for a while. I said, "You kept me for maps." She said, and there was that near smile again, "I kept you because you were worth keeping. The maps were the argument I made to the men who needed an argument." There was a moment in late winter, about a month before the thaw, that I think about still. We'd had a bad spell, 4 days of wind so hard and cold it drove through every gap in everything, and made even the fire feel like a small and insufficient protest against the size of the cold. On the second day, one of the younger men, a boy really, maybe 17, came back from checking the horse lines with his hands gone white and stiff. We worked on him for 2 hours. His hands came back mostly, though 2 of the fingers on his right hand stayed wrong for weeks and didn't fully recover until spring. On the third day, the wind let up for a few hours in the afternoon, and I went out to check the lines myself. Chayton came with me. We didn't discuss it. She just fell in beside me as I was pulling on my coat, and that was the end of the discussion. We walked the lines together. The horses were restless and nervous the way horses get when the weather has been wrong for a while. They develop an anxiety that isn't about any specific thing but is about the general wrongness of the conditions, the way it's been too hard for too long. I knew that feeling. I had felt it myself in other winters. You just keep moving and doing the next thing, and eventually the weather changes. I worked down the line, checking each animal, speaking to them the way you speak to horses when you want them to settle, low and even and without urgency, just letting them hear that something calm is nearby. Chayton watched me do this for a while, and then she started doing it too in Lakota, and the two sounds overlapped in the wind, my old voice and her clear one, talking to horses in two languages about the same thing, which was, "Hold on, it's going to change, you're all right, hold on." We finished the line and turned back toward camp. She said, walking, "You have been talking to horses like that for a long time." I said, "Since I was younger than that boy with the hands." She said, "Who taught you?" I said, "A man named Charlie Beaumont, who was the best horseman I ever knew and who died in a river crossing in the spring of '42, and who I still miss when I'm working around horses, which is always." She said, "I miss my father when the wind is like this. He hated the wind. He'd sit inside and play cards by himself and curse it." I said, "Does it help, the cursing?" She said, "It seemed to for him." I said, "I've tried it, never took." She laughed. She had a laugh that appeared and disappeared fast, like a bird that lands and is gone before you've finished looking at it. It lit her face from somewhere inside and then went out again, and her face went back to its normal state of considered attention. But the flash of it stayed in the air for a second after it was done, the way warmth does when a door has been opened and then closes. It was the most I'd heard her laugh in 3 winters of knowing her. We walked back to camp in the wind, close together by necessity of the cold and the gusts, and I was aware of her presence beside me the way you become aware of a source of warmth when you've been cold long enough. Not looking at her, just knowing she was there, and that knowing having a quality to it, solid, precise, real. When spring came, Chayton's band moved north and west as they did every year, following the patterns of the country and the game and the old knowledge of where things would be and what would be ready and when. I rode with them. I knew the country well enough to be useful at the front of the column, reading the land ahead, pointing out the places where the going was good, and the places where it looked good but wasn't, the clay flats that would hold in dry weather and become a trap after rain, the creek crossings that looked shallow and had a false bottom, the ridge trails that narrowed without warning. This is what I had. Not strength anymore, not the physical capacity I'd had at 30 or 40. But I had the country in my head, decades of it, summer and winter and wet and dry, every season overlaid on every other season, so that when I looked at a stretch of ground I was looking at all the times I'd seen it and what had happened, and what the different conditions had meant. It was the most valuable thing I owned, that layered reading, and it was the thing that no one had wanted until now. She rode beside me sometimes on those days. Not always. She had things to attend to, a band to run, decisions to make. But sometimes she would come up alongside me, and we would ride without talking for a stretch, the country opening up ahead of us, the sky doing what the sky does in spring in this country, that particular blue that has nothing behind it, no ceiling, no boundary, just blue going back and back and back until it becomes something you'd have to name God to finish naming. One morning early, we came to a ridge line, different ridge from the shoulder farther north, looking west over a long flat that ran toward the mountains. I pulled up. Studied what was below. There was a cut in the flat, a dry wash, that looked passable on the surface but I knew from 20 years before was deceptive. A clay bottom that would hold in dry weather and become 8 inches of paste after 2 days of rain, and it had rained 3 days ago and the ground hadn't had time to surface dry cleanly. The main column was a 1/4 mile behind us, spread out, the travois and the horses and the people. I pointed. Not south, not north, but diagonally, a longer way around, across the harder ground, that added maybe an hour but avoided the cut entirely. Chayton looked where I was pointing. She looked at the cut. She looked at me. I didn't explain. There wasn't time and there wasn't need. She would know the cut or she would trust the point. Those were the 2 choices, and I'd given her the information, and now it was hers. She turned her horse. She called back to the column, A word or two in Lakota, clear and carrying. The sound moving back down the line, and the whole column shifted, following her, following the angle I'd pointed. We came around the edge of the flat on the hard ground and past the cut at a distance, and I looked at it as we went by, the surface of it, innocent-looking, firm-seeming from the top. And I knew what was under that surface, and I knew what would have happened to the horses and the travois and the people if they'd tried to cross it. You don't learn that kind of thing from a map. You learn it from having been wrong once, which I had, on that same cut, in a wet April 21 years ago, and you carry it forward after that, and it becomes part of what you know, and one day someone benefits from it. Soaring Elk came up beside me as we passed the cut. He looked at it, then at me. He didn't say anything. He nodded once, the way old men in this country nod when a thing has been confirmed that they suspected but hadn't been sure of, a nod that says I thought so, which is different from I didn't know. Then he fell back into the column. Chayton was 10 yards ahead of me, riding straight, the column coming along behind her across the hard ground. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The pointing had been seen and the pointing had been followed, which in this country at this time, in this company, is the whole of what it means to be trusted. Not a speech about it, not a ceremony, just the action of following, which says everything that needs saying in the clearest language there is. I rode behind her. The mountains were ahead, the sky was that blue. The grulla moved steady under me, her breath even, her pace exactly what the ground asked for, no more, no less. I'd had good horses in my life, and she was one of them, the kind that doesn't need much from you because she's already figured out most of what there is to figure out. That night we camped on the high flat north of the cut, and the fire was good, and the sky was clear, and Chayton sat beside me after the evening work was done. She had a cup of something in both hands, and she was looking at the fire in the way she looked at things she was thinking about. She said the cut was worse than it looked. I said always is. She said, you've crossed this country in every season. I said most of them. She said, I want to know it the way you know it. I said, you know it better than I do in some ways, differently anyway. She said, that is true, but differently is not the same as the same. She turned and looked at me then, the firelight on her face. The way she had of looking that made you feel accounted for, like all the parts of you had been counted, and none of them found wanting. She said, I've been thinking about the 14 men, about the night you rode. I said, what about it? She said, you didn't know what would happen when you got to camp. You didn't know if we'd be in time. I said, no. She said, but you came anyway. I said, yes. She said, why, not the reason you tell other people, the actual reason. I looked at the fire for a moment, at the way the wood catches and holds and gives off heat in the giving up of itself. I said, because I'd been watching a long time, watching things happen and doing nothing with the watching, and I decided I was done with that. She was quiet. I said, and because I owed you a debt I hadn't found a way to pay, 11 days in that camp, the cold I came in with. She said, you didn't owe us a thing. I said, I know that's how you see it. She said, how do you see it? I said, I see it that a man who's been pulled back from somewhere he wasn't coming back from on his own, that man owes something. Maybe not to the specific people who pulled him, but to the world that went to the trouble. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, quietly, the world went to the trouble because you were worth the trouble. It was the plainest thing she'd ever said to me, and the most direct, and I didn't have an answer for it. I just let it sit there and be what it was. After a while she leaned against my shoulder, just leaned. Not looking at me, looking at the fire. The weight of her against me real and solid and warm, the way a good true thing is with mass to it, with presence, with the quality of something that exists and intends to keep existing. I didn't move. The fire burned down slow. There is a ridge I know, on the east face of the Bighorns, where on a clear morning you can see so far west that the curve of the earth starts to assert itself at the edge. I'd sat on that ridge a dozen times alone over the years and watched the light move across that distance and felt the size of it. The way the size of it makes a man understand his own scale, which is small, which is fine, which is exactly what you are when you're being honest. I want to go back to that ridge. But this time, I want her riding beside me when I get there. I think she would look at it the way she looks at everything, reading the back through the front, turning the whole long distance over in her mind, seeing what it means beneath what it looks like. And then she would look at me, and I would look at her, and we would both understand, in the wordless way you understand the things that matter most, that we had gotten to something. Not the end of anything. The beginning of the only kind of thing worth beginning. The kind that you don't rush into and can't arrange ahead of time and can't manufacture out of wanting it. The kind that grows up the same way the good things in this country grow. Slow, from deep root, in ground that's been prepared by years of hard weather, with no particular fanfare and no guarantee, and the specific stubborn quality of the thing that has decided to be here, and is going to be here, and is not going to apologize for it. I had been in this country a long time. I had been cold and alone in it and hungry in it, and I had found it beautiful even when I was all of those things, because the country doesn't owe you comfort, and the beauty of it is not contingent on how you're doing. That's one of the first lessons and one of the hardest ones, and also the one that gets you through the bad stretches, if you understand it right. I understood something now that I had not understood before, or understood it differently, which sometimes is the same thing. The blue above us that morning, the mountains ahead, the column behind, the horses and the travois and the voices and the people, moving through the country the way they'd always moved, following the season, going where the knowing took them. And her. The fact of her, the fact of being seen, being read right, being trusted, being needed, being asked to stay. That fact was as solid as the hawken across my saddle, as real as the cold, as permanent as any river. It would not go soft. It would not revise itself in the night and be something smaller in the morning. She had ridden to where I pointed. In this country, at this time, in this company, that is the whole of it. A chief does not follow where a man points unless she has decided, with the full weight of her judgment, in front of her people, that the man is worth following. And she had decided. She had turned her horse and she had called back to the column, and they had all come with her, following the angle I'd given her, and we had passed the cut on the hard ground and none of them had gone under. I had spent 40 years in this country pointing at things no one wanted to see. One morning she turned her horse and followed where I pointed, and I understood, for the first time in a long time, what it is to matter. I rode. The country opened ahead of us. The grulla's hooves on the hard ground, steady and sure. The mountains coming closer with every mile. The column behind us, the whole band moving and Chayton at the front of it and me beside her, or near enough, which is the right distance for a man who has finally found the place where what he knows is wanted and what he is seen. That's all it is at the end of it. I know what I am and what I am not. I am not a young man. I am not a man with much left in the way of future, in the counting sense, the years remaining sense. What I have is what's in front of me, which is the country and the morning and the mountains and the woman riding ahead, and what I know, which is more than most men who have lived here as long as I have because I paid attention when most men were busy being certain. Certainty will get you killed out here. I've watched it happen. Men who knew what they knew and stopped looking. Men who'd made up their minds about the country or about the people in it and stopped updating that picture when the picture changed. They're mostly dead or gone back east, the certain ones. The ones who are still here are the ones who kept watching, who kept revising, who understood that the country is not a fixed thing and that your read of it on any given morning is provisional, subject to revision, dependent on what the next mile shows you. This is what I am. A man who watches and reports and points. And she followed where I pointed. I rode. The country opened ahead of us. The grulla's hooves on the hard ground, steady and sure. The mountains coming closer with every mile. The column behind us, the whole band moving and Chayton at the front of it and me beside her, or near enough, which is the right distance for a man who has finally found the place where what he knows is wanted and what he is seen. That's the whole thing,